So, Chris, thank you so much for being a part of my podcast, which was called until early this week Therapy for Guys, but I actually changed it to Psyche. So
Huh?
you're technically the first guest with this new name, and it's the 100th episode, which I guess has no intrinsic meaning, but it's kind of a big deal for me because I started about a year ago. So it's really cool that I get to have you on because I've listened to your podcast for a long time, and your approach and what you have to say is meaningful to me and the work that I do in therapy. So I'm really excited to get to know you and to connect with you.
Wonderful. And congratulations on 100 in a year. You did 100 in a year.
Yeah, I did do 100 in a year. I worked maybe a little bit too hard.
I think I took me like 5 years to get to 100 or something.
Okay.
Yeah. Nice job.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Well, I guess would you mind just kind of starting? I kind of like to do this with every guest, just
Sure.
letting the listeners know a little bit more about who you are and kind of what you're up to professionally, and then from there we can kind of launch into a conversation.
Sure. Well, currently, I think professionally, I do a lot of things, but my primary role is as executive director, clinical director of California Family Institute, which is located in Southern California, and it's a community counseling practice that provides low cost, even no cost. Nobody's turned away, no matter what they can afford,
Hmm.
counseling services. So, and we also serve as a site to supervise and train new therapists that are interested in particular ways of working, like very collaborative, post-structuralist, social constructionist, narrative therapy, et cetera, kind of ways of working. So,
Sure. Oh, that's
yeah,
great. Yeah, it sounds like y'all are doing some really important work.
yeah. We like to think yeah, and we have fun doing it. So,
Okay, yeah, and that's important to be able to have fun doing it.
mhm.
So, Chris, one of the things that's always kind of intrigued me about your story is that you kind of started out like in the business world
Mhm.
and then transitioned into psychotherapy. I
Mhm.
was kind of wondering if you could maybe unpack a little bit of that, just kind of what led to you, yeah, going into the business world and then kind of the transition into therapy, what that was about. I'm sure there were a lot of different factors at play.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. It's kind of a long and winding story, but yeah, I did start in business. I had my own company. I co-founded a technology staffing company. I had a couple of partners. I think I was 30 when we did that. And we grew this successful business. By the time I exited, we had like 200 employees, and
Wow.
uh, yeah, we were doing really well. But in the midst of that, I had, what I say is like my third or fourth, fifth, existential crisis or whatever, midlife
Yeah.
crisis. But when I was a younger person, I entered into recovery myself, personal recovery, and when I was 26, and part of being in that process is you kind of work with others, right? And so
Sure.
and I really enjoyed that aspect of, being in conversation with people about meaningful and important things. I ended up going back to school while I was growing this company, and I got a, undergrad in psychology, and I knew I wanted to, go on and be a counselor, but I told people, well, I have these golden handcuffs, right? I had a successful business, so it was really hard for me. And I had the chair of the psychology department in my undergrad. She said to me, when I was telling her my dilemma, she said to me, Chris, she just said, Chris, if you really want it, you'll find a way.
Mm.
And it took me a couple more years, but what really happened is, at the time, it was a couple more years later when I was, kind of hemming and hawing about what I should do. And a friend of mine died by suicide. And
Oh,
the moment, yeah, it kind of rocked my world. And then it had me really reflecting on my own life and
sure.
what's important to me. And so I went to my business partner shortly after that and said, I can't do it anymore. I'm going to go back to school and become a therapist. And they were a little shocked, initially, but we worked it all out, and we're still friends to this day. And I ended up going off to grad school. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
And okay, so I have just kind of several questions in light of that. I mean, one of them, and I know I just said I kind of changed the name from therapy for guys to psyche, but I'm always curious when I connect with other male therapists, kind of what that was like. Were there any stigmas around mental health or therapy as a male, and how did you navigate that as you ultimately became a therapist?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a great question. I was thinking about. I didn't have much stigma about it. I was somebody that really enjoyed. I've been sent to therapy. Even as I think I was probably 15 or 16 the first time I got sent
Okay,
to therapy.
you,
When
you
my
were you were in high school.
Yeah, my mom was trying to like figure out what was wrong with me, and thought that that would help. And I don't know, at that age, I wasn't the greatest therapy client, quite honestly, but I didn't like the process. So, yeah, so and then later in life, post recovery, then I went back to therapy and I had just a really great therapist. Well, I had a couple therapists and I did have a moment of clarity I didn't share about with you. I had this guy, he was like 70 something years old and he was an ex pastor. And I'm not
Wow.
particularly well, I'm a Buddhist, but I wasn't Christian, but he was a Christian pastor, really interesting guy. But, and I remember, and I enjoyed him, and it was a good experience. And I remember sitting with him one time, and I just had this moment of clarity, like I want to do what he's doing, right?
Mm,
And so, but that still took a few years, and
sure.
so I'd always therapy. I'm still in therapy today, so I mean, it's something that I've always participated in, and so I understand the stigma, but I don't think I myself was influenced too much by it.
Got
Right.
you, got you. Well, okay, so that kind of leads me to kind of explore a little bit, if you're okay with it, just kind of going back even into childhood. What were some of the maybe, I don't know if there was a religious or spiritual, or just what were some of the values that kind of shaped you and maybe even impact who you are today? I'm always curious about people's stories and how those things kind of shape where they're at currently.
Yeah. Well, I was raised Catholic.
Okay.
My parents, I think, politically were Democrats, and so they were on the left. And there was this kind of, I mean, I just think, I don't remember explicitly, kind of doing that. I think, my identity formation, I think, happened. And I just released a podcast on the Radical Therapist about, I was talking to Joe McGarry, who was in punk and hardcore bands. And we were having this and I was interested in that because I think that's where my identity formation happened. I think when I was about 13 years old, a friend of mine had me listen to the Sex Pistols album for the first time,
Wow.
and so that created some sense of politic in my life. And
Yeah.
then I've discovered the Clash and some of these other bands that were a little more social justice oriented, and I think some of those things began to influence me more so than anything I can remember as like a young
Okay.
person. Although I think I what church, sure, I picked up probably
Sure. Sure.
several principles from that.
Now, maybe I haven't had a chance to listen to that specific episode. I'll go back and listen to that. But would you say that the whole, I don't know how to say it, the punk ethic or just the punk vibe, has that shaped the way you think about working with people or therapy? Like, does it still have kind of an influence on who you are as a person and the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, I think it's this. I think it's this idea of like question authority all the time.
Yes.
In narrative therapy, there's this idea of like the taken for granted. So and then and how can we kind of question the taken for granted in our world, right? And so I think a lot of that appealed to me. Like the narrative practice appealed to me because of some of those ideas of like attending power operations and relations and never kind of challenging the taken for granted and some
Sure.
of these things yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. And that kind of resonates deeply with me as well. I was actually curious, like in terms of even the programs that you did in terms of your degrees and becoming a therapist, did you go through various different schools, or did you know in the beginning you kind of wanted to do the narrative therapy approach? I was curious kind of what
Yeah,
that looked like.
that's a great question. I always tell people Yeah, when I came into my graduate program, I would have self-identified as like an existentialist, right?
Okay, yeah,
That meaning making was everything. I was, very influenced by like a Victor Yalom or
sure,
some of the other existentialists. This idea, and and what kind of surfacey knowledge I had about all that at the time, right? But I knew going in that I wanted to work in a particular, but it was about meaning making. I wasn't really interested in interventions or the next shiny intervention or whatever it might be. I was just really interested in conversations and meaning making and that kind of thing. But then I realized, then I went to school and I had some very influential friends and mentors, and then I quickly discovered that not everybody is free to make meaning, that there
mm,
are constraints to meaning making for certain folks, right? And so then I became interested in other ideas about how to support people in the larger social cultural context, and the isms like the racisms and the sexisms and those kinds of things that do create constraints in people's lives. And then I discovered narrative therapy about that same time, and so I thought narrative therapy captured what I really liked about meaning making, but also attending to these larger the larger social cultural contexts and power
sure.
operations, and you know like Deleuze's lines of force or Foucault's normalizing judgment and the panopticon and all that kind of stuff. So
Oh yeah.
it became very interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really great. As kind of I don't even know if it's an aside, but I'd be curious if you could weigh in on this. One of the things that's been frustrating for me lately with I guess it is kind of in light of kind of all the mass shootings, it seems like more of the right is now saying, it's a mental health issue. But I don't know exactly what they mean by that. I feel like they're missing the quote unquote mental health components that you're talking about, which are related to these larger social issues. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think there's the politic at play, right?
Yeah,
And I think that's the difference between the right and the left, for example. I think not to I mean, there's just I don't know. There's a lot of complexity in there too, but
sure.
um, yeah, I think it's distract and whatever you got to do, and I don't I don't think it takes in. It's maybe a part of the picture. It doesn't give you the whole picture. And we live in a world where people want to create certainty, right? Or
Mm,
just to take these complicated things and just point to like, well, it's a mental health issue. But once you start expanding it, then people's tolerance for that complexity kind of goes away, and they would
sure.
rather just make it about whatever kind of thing. And so, yeah, mental. But then they blame it on mental health, and then there's no funding for any of that. So,
And there's no funding for it.
yeah,
Exactly. No, that's a
right.
great point.
So it's just kind of hollow anyway, and hollow argument.
Sure.
If they really believe that, maybe they would do something about it. But nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a great point. Now, I know if I can take a step back again, one of the things that's been intriguing to me about your story is, yeah, your connection to something like Zen Buddhism. And I was
Mhm.
wondering if you could talk about how you got into that, and then if there's any way in which you find that it shapes you as a therapist.
Sure.
Because I think there's ways in which there are people out there that really integrate something like Buddhism and psychology, but then I think there's ways in which it just kind of shapes them as people, and that comes out maybe not as explicitly in their therapy. And I didn't know if there was some of that that would be applicable to your story.
Yeah. Yeah. So how that happened for me, I think, I was always a reader, right? So I was always
Okay,
reading different spiritual
sure.
books, even pre-recovery, right? And so, but when I entered into recovery, and my life was changing drastically, um, I had a guy in my life, and I think everybody should have this kind of guy in their life. Who's that guy that's like older and he's read every spiritual book, and you know what I mean, and
Yes.
he's a vast knowledge, and
some type of
And
sage or something.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. He was out for me. And one night I remember he like said to me, "Chris, you better get comfortable in the gray." And
Mm,
I knew what he was telling me was important. I didn't know what he meant at the time, quite honestly, and but I knew what he was saying to me was important. And what I've come to understand is that he was telling me, "Chris, you know, the world isn't black and white. You're going to have to
mm,
learn to live in uncertainty and in the gray of the world, and it'll make your life a lot easier if you can kind of lean into that, right?" And that's something that's always stuck with me since, and something I aspire to continually. But he was also the guy that introduced me to meditation. He had
okay.
discovered that I couldn't go to sleep at that time without the radio on. I had like what they call the monkey mind, you know, as
Sure.
busy. And he gave me this cassette tape. That's how old I am, right? So he gave me this cassette tape, and one side was a meditation instruction, on the other side was a guided meditation, and so I put it in my Walkman, and that started my meditation practice. And then, you know, I was doing that for a while, and then I didn't want somebody talking to me, and so I went to silent meditation. But then I was like, "Am I doing this right?" You know,
Right.
right? You know, I didn't know, and I was getting benefit. I ended up being able to start sleeping without having to have the radio on, that kind of thing. But I didn't know. I thought I could go deeper than what I was doing, and so I sought out, seeking out spiritual teachers. I started going places and doing things, and you know, I've discovered Zen Buddhism, and it kind of really fit for me. It felt like
Mm.
kind of like really comfortable to me, and maybe that was my because of my Catholicism bringing up. You know, there's some similarities about ritual and
Oh
chanting
yeah.
and like, you know, and the liturgy and stuff like that. But yeah, and then I just liked what it had to teach about,
Mm,
you know, well, this idea, you know, well, a lot of different ideas about tell me how to sit in the soup of my own suffering, right? How to
mm,
like not try to escape in all the ways that we escape, to be comfortable in the uncertainty of life and in the suffering of life and in the struggle of life, and like and being and it expanded my ability to experience all of life and not just chase feeling good, right?
mm.
And just to kind of be in all of life. And I don't think we live in a world where people know how to do boredom anymore.
Oh, it's so true.
Right? And so Zen taught me how to do boredom, right? Like be in the just, you know, because you're sitting so much in meditation and stuff like that,
Oh
and
yeah.
so that was great. And I think you know, there's a teaching in Zen about that Zen is Zen. There's nothing to attain, right? There's
Mm,
good for nothing, and I really appreciate that idea of like where, you know, the real gold can be found in the imperfections of our lives and our families and relationships and communities, right? And that we don't have to change anything, right? We just have to live our lives as they are. And, you know, and then it also helped me with the inevitable heartbreaking nature of life, right?
mm.
That my Zen teacher, James Ford, he wrote a book called, and I really love this title, he wrote a book called "If You're Lucky, Your Heart Will Break."
Oh wow.
Yeah, and it's a great book if you, for those interested in maybe an entryway into Zen Buddhism. But and that's true. You know, it sounds like what? It's kind of contradictory, right? This idea, but it's I've come to believe it to be true. You're if you're lucky, your heart will break, and I spent a lot of my life trying to avoid heartbreak, and
Mm.
creating a lot of heartbreak for myself. Right?
Right, right. Would you say that heartbreak is ultimately inevitable and not something we can
No,
really prevent?
no, yeah. We try, and we
We
try, and
we
all the
try.
way we create suffering in our life, but
Mm,
no, no, it's just, you know, you know, that's one of the tenets of Buddhism, right? That everything is impermanent, right? And
right.
that includes our relationships, our loved ones. You know, everything's going to go away.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
So, okay, Chris, I'd love to ask you this. I'm not a Buddhist, but I've always been intrigued by the philosophy and have read quite a bit on it. And you know, so I'll try to bring two things together. You know, at some level, as a therapist, I know people come to me, and at some level, they're trying to discover themselves, who they are, trying to forge some kind of identity. But then
Hmm.
I know in Zen Buddhism and other flavors of Buddhism, there's this idea of the no self,
Hmm.
and the wisdom of sort of not holding on to a type of identity. I wonder how you think about those two poles, you know, kind of constructing a self and an identity, but then also recognizing that maybe that's a type of fiction or something that's not really there.
Yeah, I did a video on my YouTube channel, the Radical Therapist YouTube channel, called "The Myth of the Authentic Self." Right, that
Oh, okay. Say more about that. That's great. I missed that. Okay.
it's just this idea of, like, but I think it's a kind of a uh, it's a waste of time. I don't know what you want to say, but and I think a lot of people have different ways of saying this. The social
Mm,
constructionists would say, that we are all constructed in relationship, and then I think, the psychoanalysts would say, we're all created in ideology or something, some critique of that, right? Or,
sure.
um, and so I think, yeah, I just think we can't. We're just so conditioned. Buddhism would say we're just so conditioned by our cultures, right? Which I
Mm,
don't disagree with, right? We can't escape the water we swim in, whatever our cultures are, and so but that's the great mystery, right? Isn't that the great mystery, to find out, to Dogen, who's probably the most underrated philosopher, Japanese Zen
yeah.
person, important person in Japanese Zen. But Dogen would say, to study the self is to, like, lose the self. I'm
Mm,
pushing it, but and I think if we do that, if we examine how we're conditioned, it just makes our lives go. Yeah, we're not so reactive to the world. That we can see how we're, like, the water we're swimming in. We can see how we're being influenced in various ways, and there's some mystery there. I don't know what you might find. I don't know if it's an authentic self, but maybe it's that piece that connects us all together in a way
mhm.
that that I think we intuitively know.
Yeah. Oh man, I really like that. No, thank you for kind of riffing on that. You know, since you mentioned Dogen and just kind of the kind of the philosophical tradition, that is one thing that has always intrigued me about you and your podcast that I think I've connected with is your interest in, different types of philosophy and then how you I'm assuming kind of bring some of that into the therapy office, into the clinic. I was hoping maybe you could talk about some of the philosophical influences in your life,
Mhm.
what they mean to you personally, and then if there's any ways you do apply them in therapy, I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in ideas and, like, what people are thinkers, and, like, and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Um and so I'm always, like, reading and listening and watching and, like, paying attention to, even contemporary thinkers. I'm kind of interested, not so much in past thinkers, although I do am influenced by some of that, but I'm interested in current people that, and how people are thinking about things and what some ideas are going on out there. And that's what I want the podcast to be too. Like, how can I curate various ideas and bring those together and let people sort them out the way they want to sort them out? But
Yeah. Well, you've done a great job with that, so thank you for hosting that space.
thanks,
Because
thanks.
I've been able to do the very thing you wanted listeners to do.
Wonderful,
So
wonderful.
thank you. If you want to start, I think you were saying you're more into kind of contemporary ideas or thinkers, and I'm
Mhm.
just curious, maybe if you could pick a few that you really enjoy, and then maybe talk about in terms of the ideas, what's energizing about those, and then maybe how you kind of think about connecting that to therapy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'm interested. People have been very influential to me, or people like Bruno Latour, who just recently passed away, actually.
Mm,
But I think he will come to be a very important voice, I think. Um, and I think Gloria Anzaldúa, who I've spoken about a couple of times, primarily with Anna Louise Keating and her
yes.
post-oppositionality, and that's how I got introduced to Anzaldúa's work. And um, Peter Rollins, I think, has been on your
Oh
podcast.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a psychoanalytic um, philosopher person, but I do like listening to other ideas of other folks.
Sure.
And I'm thinking of, recently I read T.J. Demos, and Theo Ellison. I'm interested in how we work with the future. I think there's
Mm,
a lot of like turning to the past in therapy, and I'm
sure.
interested in um, Michael White, who was co-founder of narrative therapy, written a
Right.
lot about it, talked about that if people are entering into some form of liminal space or uncertainty, that we should help give them predictions of some kind of the experiences they might have. And so
Mm,
that's kind of been having me interested in how we work with the future and the present at the same time with people.
got you.
And there's a well-known psychoanalyst, Adam Phillips. He talks about, he had written something about the fact that people often come to therapy talking about experiences they haven't had yet.
Mm,
And so it's kind of that worst case scenario. So I've become interested in people that are writing and talking about futuring or futurisms
okay. Chris,
or
can you go there? Because that sounds fascinating. It's something that I don't often think about, but
yeah.
I have to agree if we're kind of talking about the same thing, that so many of my clients are either stuck in the past or they just keep on going back to it and repeating old patterns. And there really is a sense where therapy is so much about this futuring, but I haven't really given much thought to it. I'd be curious if you could help me with that. What are some of the
Yeah,
ideas? And
that is like the bulk of like what I'm thinking about right now. So
okay,
often,
man,
what I would say, what often gets characterized as self-sabotage or repeating the same behaviors
sure.
or relapse or anything like that, or just being stuck, is often I characterize it or I conceptualize it as people are standing at the threshold of liminal space, right?
Mm,
Michael White wrote about it as like being between the known and familiar and the possible to know, and that in between that space is what we is called liminal space, right? And and that liminal space is where that's where have you seen that meme where it says there's a circle and it says comfort zone, and then there's a circle and it says where the magic happens,
yes.
and the two are not touching, right? And there's always a space in between. That space is where all change happens,
Mm,
where innovation happens, where all the stuff happens. But that space also, liminal space also it's a very destabilizing, can be very terrifying.
yes.
And so when people are repeating the same thing, they're just going back. They might step into liminal space, but they often turn back
Mm,
um, to the known and familiar and whatever that might be. And so our jobs as therapists, I've become to describe myself not so much as a therapist, but a liminal space tour guide, right?
oh, I like that.
And so how do we help people? Vygotsky would say, how do we scaffold people into the
Yes, I
zone of
love Lev
proximal
Vygotsky, by
development?
the way.
Okay,
He's
yeah,
great.
wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah,
so his zone of proximal development would be
sure.
kind of a map to move through liminal space, right? That we walk with and then walk alongside, kind of walk alongside and then move away and let people go. But this is where the future talk has to come in therapy, because we have to support people in kind of some expectation or predictions of experiences they might have. So when they do happen, they're not so prone to turning back to what is known and familiar,
Got
right?
it. Got it. Chris,
And
could you
and
speak
I'm
about those? Like
yes,
some
like
experiences that people will likely have in that liminal space?
yeah, you know, I don't know, trying to do a career change was a common one, right? And
Sure.
I want to, or it's like somebody. Oftentimes, I'm sure you've had this happen. Somebody comes to you, and I'm like, I'm an accountant, but I want to be an artist, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
All the
how do I?
time.
Yeah, right. So how do I take that leap? And so that is the work, right? Rather than
Mm,
how do we support them and what they might expect in that. And that's why I become interested in like future scenarios, right? How do we create multiple futures and talk about what might be required in all of those possible futures? Because oftentimes people come to therapy with worst case scenarios, right?
right.
Like, and so those things are like creating no movement. And so how do we populate other possible futures when we're talking with clients, right? And then
Sure.
working back from there about like what experiences might you have in these efforts
Mm,
of real change, right? Is
sure.
that helpful?
Yeah, no, it's super helpful.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but one of the things that's coming up is at the same time, I think it's a different type of future, but I'm just curious how you would think about this and how your therapeutic approach kind of connects with it. I think I'm seeing a lot of younger people coming into therapy and they're sort of afraid of the future with like climate change and just
Mhm.
the craziness that's going on, in our world, the divisive politics, we can go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Do you ever get into that type of future? Do you see that being something that you have to navigate as a therapist, helping people make sense of that?
Yeah, you have me thinking. Next year, I'm co-editing what is titled an Encyclopedia of Radical Helping, and it's going to be
Nice.
put out by Thick Press in 2024. And I'm co-editing it with Aaron Siegel and Julie Chow and Cho, and I'm thinking about Julie and Aaron talk about one of their contributions to the encyclopedia is what's called ongoingness, right?
Mm,
This idea of ongoingness. How do we still move and not get paralyzed by just the overwhelmingness of the challenges ahead, right? And I think that's why this futuring work is like so important. How do we, because what we really need are these skills. How are we going to create new worlds together in this, right? If we can't even get started. And so the way that we do that, I think, is like to have these kinds of conversations of what is going to be required, what will support you on these journeys through liminal space, um, who can do them with you, who would you want to have part of this, circulating their stories, who will help you in these efforts, and just kind of supporting people in the ongoingness that's going to be required in this hard work of world making, right?
mm. Yeah, no, that's really good. It's like I got to think more about that ongoingness because that's a category that really resonates with me.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I think it was Donna Haraway in her book. I forget what it's titled, but she has this phrase, sticking with the trouble or lingering with the difficulty,
uh,
and that
Michael White
quite.
would call it loitering with intent.
Oh, that's good. Loitering with intent. Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
So, do you see yourself as someone who's hopeful? As you think about futuring, as you think about the future, um, would you be a bit of an optimist, or how would you kind of characterize
Yeah,
yourself?
that's interesting. I think people that know me kind of call me a curmudgeon, but I think that's just the performance of, because I
Sure.
think curmudgeons are like off. I think are very hopeful people, right? That's why they're curmudgeonly,
Yeah.
and I don't think I would do this work if I wasn't hopeful, right?
Mm,
I think of it as like a Cato Weingarten writes about reasonable hope, right?
mm.
Sometimes I think hope can betray. I know people in my clinic always think I'm being nihilistic when I say that, but it can in certain ways, and so I'm interested in kind of a reasonable hope, and but I don't think you can, and I don't think you can do this. You tell me. I don't think we could be in this work if we weren't like hopeful
Absolutely.
in some ways, right?
Sometimes I'll be sitting with, some of the worst suffering imaginable, and
Mm,
when other people can't see a way forward or they've lost hope, I will try to be as honest as possible and say, I don't know what the solution's going to be or what the next 5 years are going to look like, but I wouldn't be sitting here across from you if I didn't think some type of hope was possible, some type of growth or transformation. Very humble and tentative about what that's going to look like and how to get there. But I do believe, as I sometimes say, in a tomorrow, in
mm,
a tomorrow that can be better,
mm,
even if that's minuscule.
mm. Well, and that's why I'm like interested in the future. I mean, and helping support people into moving into the future in like creative ways, and because we need that, right?
Mm,
We need that now more than ever.
sure, sure. Chris, how do you feel about in terms of this ongoingness and this futuring? Do you see a role for like groups, communities, organized relationships?
Oh
And,
yeah.
I'm asking that because on the one hand, I came from kind of organized religion. I'm no longer affiliated with that, and there's some pieces of that were very helpful in organizing and promoting ideas. But there's always this shadow side. There's authoritarianism. There's all kinds of bad shit that comes with that.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of hesitant to get back into kind of groups and communities, but I do see the value in them. So I'm curious how someone like you thinks about that. I know that's a complicated question, but I'm just curious to see where you go with that.
Yeah, but I think it's an important question, and I think we're losing our ability to be relational, and
Mm,
I think from like church attendance is down. I'm sure you're aware of that, and
yes.
across the board. And we don't have community civic groups so much anymore. The Kiwanis Club and the Lions Club and stuff. They're dying away too, and so we're losing our
That social capital that Robert Putnam
that's
talks about.
and the spaces for us to come together. We're losing our ability to coalesce and create coalitions. I think that's why I'm interested in like Judith Butler talking about backgrounding identity claims, like identity
Mm,
politics, and in an effort to foreground our ability to build coalitions. Because I mean, that's the only way we're going to get political power or change is going to happen. And the more that we
right.
separate and we do have an epidemic of loneliness, at least
Yes.
in the US for sure. There are deaths of despair on the rise, what they're calling deaths of despair. And so yeah, community is messy, but just because it's messy doesn't mean we can't shy away from it. That's why I'm interested in like how do we help people do the messy, right? And
Yeah, that's good.
do with uncertainty. And like even myself, it's I'm a gold medal isolator. I should say that for everybody listening. So
And I'm a platinum one.
yeah, yeah. So I am trying to practice what I preach
Same
too.
here.
Easier for me just to go be by myself. It really is. So but I'm also, because of my participation in like 12 step groups, I know what it's like to be
Mm,
a community of people who, what they say in recovery is who would normally not mix, right?
got you.
So, that's been a great teacher for me too. So, but we are losing that ability. And I think, at a time that we need it more than ever.
Sure, sure. And one of the things that kind of resonates with me about you and your podcast and the narrative therapy and collaborative approaches, and I think it's Kenneth Gergen, is just the value of coming together and constructing conversations and realities
Mm-hmm.
that might not otherwise be.
Yeah.
And that's difficult work, but I think it's important.
Well, I think if we're going to have even survive as humanity, we have to be able to do it, right? We're at a threshold, right? As humanity, I think we're at another threshold, and it's like we could either turn back, and you see that in these movements of like make America great again. It's
Right.
wanting to go back to the known and familiar.
That's well said.
And it's what we need is no. We need to go to the possible to know, but we have to traverse liminal space in doing that, and that's scary and it's uncertain, and there's no predicted outcome. And how do we tolerate that, right?
Sure, sure.
Like Trungpa Rinpoche, he was a Buddhist teacher. He said the bad news is that you're falling and there's no parachute, and the good
Mm.
news is there's no ground. Right?
Oh man. Oh, I like that.
So yeah, it feels like falling. I had a friend of mine say, "Yeah, it just takes faith, and faith has no handles." Right?
Mm. Yeah,
Right.
that's good. That's
Mm.
really good. Now, do you have, because I know this is one of the contemporary realities that's difficult to navigate. It's kind of a hot button issue, but especially with like maybe younger people, do you have any thoughts on like social media or just the internet, the digital in general, and how that maybe is working against social bonds and community building?
Yeah.
Do you see
Well,
it that way, or do you have a
yeah,
different perspective?
I do. I mean, I think it can provide spaces of connection that
Sure.
would normally not
Just like
access.
this.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's all available, but I think the real work is going to be done offline. Yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
Now, just for the sake of the listeners, and I'm going to kind of write it down in my mind, in terms of this futuring and what we were talking about a moment ago, is there a book that you would recommend someone start with if they're kind of
Um,
interested in just digging deeper into that?
yeah. I think I have it here somewhere really quick. There's an article. Um, well, I'm writing a book, so
Okay, so we'll just have to wait until that comes out.
yeah, you're gonna have to wait till that comes out, but it's gonna come out. But there's a paper by Theo Ellison that I think. Oh, it's Disciplined Imagination, I think, is the paper
Okay,
that he wrote, and I think, and that's the art of speculation, or something like that. But Theo
okay,
Ellison, he's I think an English academic. We'll give you a history of you know tools of prediction from like the Cold War avant-garde to present moment,
sure,
and I think it's interesting to get people to start thinking about that. So,
sure,
and any
sure.
of the work of I think I'm just going to say her name, Renata Tizik, and she's in England as well, and she writes about future scenarios,
Okay,
and so she's worth reading too. Yeah.
okay, yeah, that's really interesting.
Mm.
Now, are you able for a moment to talk a little bit about some of the organizing that you do? You know, throughout the years, I've seen that you have these gatherings that are connected to your podcast, and just curious, kind of what that's about, and if someone
Yeah.
were
Well,
interested, how?
it's me doing what you're trying to say. Like, how do I create community, right?
Okay,
So it's me trying to do those kinds of same things. How do I commu- create community? At California Family Institute too, we do things like narrative and pizza, where we'll do some conversations around the practice, and but get some pizzas and bring people together from different contexts. And it's great too, because we get, somebody said this to me the other day, that we had people showing up that are actually not therapists, they're just interested in these kinds of conversations, and that was a great compliment, that we were getting people that were not just therapists, right? They,
yeah, that's great.
from different, all kinds of different contexts. So it was kind of fun. But so that all of that stuff is just me, because even though I'm a gold medal isolator, I do really like people. Like conversation with people.
Sure.
I like trying to create community, and I think it's important. So it's me trying to do
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay, so Chris, I know that I've kind of come to the end of the questions that I had for you. I'm just so appreciative of this chance to connect and kind of build this bond with you. I just wonder if there's anything else that you'd want any of the listeners to know about you, or anything that's coming up. I'll try to include all your information in the show notes and all of that. But as we come to a close, is there sort of some final words, or just anything else you'd want to talk about?
No, I really appreciate your questions, Kike, and inviting me on. And if there's one thing I would leave with people, that I have hope.
Got
And
you.
how do we create a future that we all want to be a part of, right?
Mhm.
But also caution people that it's going to be hard work. So, you know,
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you're promoting any kind of utopic ideal or some easy
no,
strategy.
I'm anti-utopia, actually.
I,
So,
I am too. Well, and you know what else too? I think what I'm really anti, and this is working with so many like bright-eyed teenagers sometimes, is that the future is not just going to be a place of happiness.
mm-mm.
There may be those moments, but some of it will be very ordinary and unhappy.
Well, and remember, if you're lucky, your heart will break,
If you're
right?
lucky, your heart will break. I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah.
So, Chris, thanks again. I appreciate it.